Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Nick Grossman. Today's webinar topic is Alpine Heights, Biomes of Australia, Part 2, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Nikki Sentinella. Nikki, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Nick. And hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to part two of this little series I've been doing on some of the biomes of Australia, getting us a little bit more familiar with the different and unique biomes that we have here in Australia. I say here, I'm currently not in Australia, I'm over in Belgium, but I'll be back in less than a week to continue guiding our southern itinerary. So, if you haven't seen me around before, my name is Nikki. I am Australian. I grew up in Sydney, and I've also done a lot of work and travel around most of Australia, generally focusing on the southern part. I'm an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures. I'm also a keen naturalist, and I'm a conservation biologist by trade as well. So, I've done a lot of study and research projects across the continent, and I'll be sprinkling in a little bit of that knowledge as we go along. But I wanted to introduce you guys to some of the more unique areas of Australia and give a bit more context of what makes this continent this continent. So today I wanted to dive into the Alpine regions of Australia. Now, we don't really think of Australia with its hot big deserts and the outback and the sunny beaches as an alpine area, but we do have some areas that get snow. You will see not that much snow in my presentation, however, because we don't get that much if we think about our whole area. So I'm going to introduce what is alpine, what defines an alpine region, how do we decide that as a classification, I'm going to talk about Australia generally and where we're looking as the flattest continent, as well as where those alpine regions are specifically in Australia. I also wanted to introduce you to a couple of species you may not be familiar with. I have spoken a fair bit on some of my other webinars, looking at our classic Australian animals like our kangaroos, our koalas, our wombats, as you can see down here. And we do see some of these guys up in our alpine regions, but I wanted to introduce you to a couple of our critically endangered species. We have our corroboree frog and our mountain pygmy possum. So I'll introduce you to those ones a little bit later. And I also just wanted to talk a little bit generally towards the end about some of the natural and unnatural modifications that we're seeing in the alpine region in Australia, what that means for these species, what it means for moving forward, and just getting us thinking about what those impacts could be. And then again, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them throughout the webinar or towards the end, and I'll try and field as many of them as I can. Okay, so let's get stuck in. What is alpine? So there's a few different definitions. I talked about this when I talked about rainforest definitions in Australia as well, and they can sometimes be a little bit subjective. Uh, we think of alpine as high, so we can think of altitude, um, but generally that varies around the world. What is high in Australia is certainly not considered high in other areas. So we can see if we look at what's considered alpine, for example, in the Rocky Mountains in North America, it could be from as low as 760 meters, which is about 2,500 feet in the Yukon. But as we move down in latitude, that alpine region starts generally around 12,000 feet. It's a huge difference, or 3 kilometers in altitude. So that's down in New Mexico. So depending where you are, altitude isn't always a clear indicator of what alpine is. But generally, we are talking higher, but that high is relative. The other thing that we look at is the tree line. And again, using a North American example, you can see that boreal forest line. When I'm up in Churchill guiding to go look at the lakes or the polar bears, you can see that really distinct line between the boreal forest, our big, beautiful evergreen trees, and then the tundra, where we just have these treeless plains. And so often we're looking at an area that doesn't have trees because it's too high, it's too cold, and those trees are no longer growing. So we start to come into this alpine region, which looks like our more grassland, our shrubs, our sphagnum, and our peatlands. That's kind of what we picture when we think of the alpine region. In Australia, we don't have a clear-cut tree line. We're not defined by our latitude. We're not far enough south to start seeing that. We do have some smaller mountains that we do start to see these areas lose the trees, but there's no straight line. So again, it's a little bit hazy. The other thing that we can look at is our temperature. So the temperature generally when we're looking at an alpine definition, we're looking at maximum, like say in our summer months, an average of that month is only going to be 10 degrees Celsius, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's cool in the hottest period. And we do have areas of that in Australia. And I'll point out Charlotte's Pass, where I have our record low temperature, which is nothing compared to other parts of the world, but for us it's very cold. And so temperature, again, is just another one of these factors. Functional ecology is a little bit more broader to categorize. Functional ecology I sort of define as what you can see as that ecosystem looking like, what are the plant structures, the soil quality that then creates a habitat for certain species. And we see things that react in a certain way because it's in a colder environment or a higher altitude or not having that tree cover. So all these factors together form the biology, the species, the animals, and the plants that we go and see because of all these factors. And we kind of see that as our functional ecology. So this is where we start to see our trees getting shorter because there's so much cold, there's so much wind, they're getting stunted. We're seeing the rainfall will be varied, and we'll see animals starting to hibernate. So quite functional behavioral adaptations to the cold. We'll see the fur of certain animals get longer and things like that. So a really quite clear delineation of what works in this environment versus what works in a slightly lower altitude. So really what is alpine? It's a combination of all of these things together. It depends who you ask. If you ask a climate scientist, it's going to be different to an ecologist. It's going to be different to a geologist. So when we think of alpine, we're going to stick to this generally high up, generally cold, generally treeless-ish. But we will have a few trees in our Australian alpine. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the subalpine together, just as a broad category. So there's some loose definitions for you. But where does this exist in Australia? Where are our alpine regions? Australia, this is kind of what we picture. This is the lowest and the flattest continent on Earth. It is characterized by these big stretches of arid land. This is out in the Hay Plains where I did my honours thesis, and it really is as flat as far as you can see. But we do have some areas that are a little bit higher. So this is a topographical map of Australia. And you can see some mountain ranges on the east coast here. This is what we call the Great Dividing Range. It does divide this more flat, arid and semi-arid region in the inland of Australia from the more temperate climate on the coast, on the east coast. And so this is where we start to see a little bit more activity in terms of snowfall. And if you have a look at the bottom of that range, if we look in Victoria, that state down the bottom, and the edge of New South Wales, that's when we see our Australian Alps. The Australian Alps, we also call the Snowy Mountains. We have so few snowy mountains, we just have to call one range the Snowy Mountains. That's all we need to know where you're talking about. But you'll also notice all the way down south in Tasmania. Tasmania is our island state down the bottom there, or Lutruwita. And Lutruwita also has a mountain region. So there are some alpine and subalpine regions there. And so we'll be talking about these two groups sort of together, but I will focus a little bit more on our snowy mountains. To give you a little bit more context, this is a little diagram of the highest peaks on each continent. the seven summits, which you can try and summit all of them, which was first done by Richard Bass in 1985. And you can see right at the very end is Mount Kosciuszko in Australia. That is our tallest mountain. And you can see it's not very pointy. It is a pretty beautiful rolling hill area. Believe it or not, this lovely ambling slopes. This is Mount Kosciuszko, Mount Kosciuszko. This is Australia's tallest mountain. This is obviously taken in the summertime, and it is quite easy to get up there. So Mount Kosciuszko, or Kosciuszko, is named after a Polish pioneer by a Polish explorer, another Polish explorer by Strzelecki. It is only 2,228 meters tall, so 7,300 feet, and that is the tallest of the mainland Australian continent. If we go up to Papua New Guinea, which is technically in the same plate, the tectonic plate of the Australian landmass, then there is a taller mountain there. So if you're doing the seven summits, there's disputes over which one you should be doing. Mount Kosciuszko is quite easy to summit until 1977. There was a road about 100 meters from the summit, and you can just pop out of your car and amble up to the top, and then you've reached the tallest point in Australia. Now that road is closed because it is a very ecologically sensitive area. A lot of this area takes a long time to grow. And so now you have to do a mile. It's a little bit longer, but still quite an easy walk. You can see in this image just behind to the left of that arrow, you can see a straight line. That is the path and the boardwalk that goes over that sensitive vegetation. You can see here, this is the summit in the edge shoulder season. It's really winter yet. Winter will cover completely in snow, but this is one afternoon I went for a walk to the top of Australia. You don't need any mountaineering experience to get up here, but it is a beautiful view and really good for backcountry skiing. The mountains here, you can see around, is very flat. It's not that rocky. We don't have these big jagged peaks, and we don't have these deep valleys either. Compared to the Himalaya, the Alps, the Rockies, these mountains weren't formed by a compression of the plates, folding the landmass upwards into these mountains. This was just a movement of magma when Gondwana, so Gondwana is the southern supercontinent, started to break up. So we had some activity in the center of our plate and this welled up and created these mountains. This was about 130 to 160 million years ago, so not quite in our memory. And there's been a lot of slow weathering that's happened, and it's resulted in this more soft landscape and generally Australia being quite flat because we didn't have those big forces pushing up these mountains. We have had a few glaciers that have helped to shape it, generally quite a smooth landscape. So this is another map of Australia, and if you have a look down in the bottom right in the red, this is the area that's sort of classified as the Australian Alps, according to a few different definitions. These are all the bioregions, all of these regions here. And so you can see it's a really small area. It only takes up about 0.3% of Australia's land. So again, snowy mountains, you're not going to confuse it for anywhere else. But we can also start to include some of the things down in Tasmania. This is Charlotte's Pass. This is near Mount Kosciuszko, and this is where we've recorded our lowest temperature. And this record low was recorded in 1994, and it had a record low of minus 23 degrees Celsius. So that's minus 9.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So may not be too cold, especially when I've been living up in Canada and now up in Europe. Feels like nothing, but for us that's very, very cold. Generally throughout the season we'll get temperatures below minus 10 degrees, which for us is very cold. If you ask a Sydney sider what's cold, we'll probably say it's about 18 degrees Celsius or like 65 Fahrenheit. Yeah, we don't have a good cold tolerance sometimes, but we do get excited when it snows. This here is a map of that southern island state, Tasmania. This is an area showing highland high altitude without trees. So these are some of our beyond the tree line areas. And as you can see, there isn't a nice straight line that we can follow like we can in the north of North America or across the north of Europe. We don't have that neat delineation. We have these little patches depending on the little microclimates that form as the weather moves from the west across the east and creates these different climates. So these areas we consider alpine and subalpine as well. So this adds to larger scope. And we do get snow down in Tasmania. This is Cradle Mountain. This is where we go on both our Australian South trip and the ultimate Australia trip. We go up into this alpine region of Tasmania, beautiful dolerite mountain, and this is it with some snow on it. Clouds often quite low, it often obscures the mountain, so we do get lucky when we get a beautiful clear view. And you can see the snow there, not too thick. This was in summer, this was during our season that we go and do our trips with NatHab. And so every now and then you might just get snow for a few days, but it rarely settles. And then in the winter, it can come down a little bit lower. Definitely worth bringing a jumper. You just never know in those alpine areas. And this is a picture of me during a very unusual snow settling period in the Blue Mountains, which is just behind Sydney. So part of that Great Dividing Range, but not part of the Alpine region that we call the Snowy Mountains. So it was quite unusual for us. We all got very excited. There's some snowballs being thrown around. And after living in Canada, I do think it's quite funny that we're so excited by this measly spattering of snow. For a lot of Australians, this is a really exciting thing, and we spent all day playing around like we were kids because we don't get that this often. So this is the Alpine region in the summertime, and you can see that we have far fewer trees. We mainly just have this grassland. It's very open. The base of this is mainly our sphagnum mosses or our bogs, holding a lot of water, similar to what we would see in a tundra. And living in the Alpine here, it may look like there's not always a lot going on, especially when you take away some of the tree line. But there's hundreds of species of animals living here. So mammals, over 200 species of bird in the Australian Alps, reptiles, frogs, fish. We also see hundreds of species of plant that are only found in this region. So in Tasmania, in this picture just behind, we have just under 300 plant species that are only found in this region. And so there's a lot of diversity that is happening beneath this small substrate of grasses and shrubs. We do see our echidnas, our wombats, our padymelons, which are like a wallaby. We'll see kangaroos come up here too, and they can be found in the snow. I have spoken about these guys a fair bit in some of my other webinars, so I won't be going on about them too much, but if you want to have a look at some of our archives, you'll find some more information on them. But we do see, this is our beautiful echidna. This guy you can see on the left is very, very spiny, and then on the right, a lot more fur. And our echidnas can be found down on the sea level beaches, in the desert, to up in these alpine regions. And when it gets colder, they have longer fur, shorter spines, because it's more important for them to stay nice and warm. So they're more of a generalist species. We see our lovely wombats as well. This is again down in Tasmania, and Cradle Mountain is our best opportunity to see wombats on our NatHab tours, which is why we go for our Australian South and Ultimate. They're very, very cute. And just this dense block of muscle and fur, really, really well adapted to the cold. They burrow under the ground where the temperature can be a bit more consistent. And then we also have our padymelon, which is like, you can see, like a little kangaroo or a little wallaby. And our carnivorous marsupials, which I speak about in Tasmania as well, our Tasmanian devil and our quolls. So all of these guys are fairly well adapted to living in lower areas as well as higher altitude areas. We have a couple of species that are really specialized at being present in the very high altitude and are also a little bit threatened because of that. So I wanted to introduce you to, firstly, the corroboree frog. So the corroboree frog, we have the southern and the northern corroboree frog. The range here is only a few hundred kilometers apart. We're not talking North and South Australia. They're all found within that Australian Alpine region. And our northern corroboree frog is doing all right. Our southern corroboree frog is our most critically endangered species in all of Australia. And so these guys are very small. You can see they've got this beautiful pattern on them. You can see one here in someone's hand. Give you an idea, that's a fully grown adult there. That's a good size adult as well. They only really get to be about 2.5 to 3 centimeters long, a bit over an inch. That's it. So very, very small, very brightly colored. And as I said, most critically endangered species in Australia. Now, to put that into context, as of March 2022, we have only 30 wild individuals as adults known to us in this population, and we've been monitoring them for a number of years. We first noticed declines around in the 70s, and we had a population estimate about 10 years ago that was around 40 individuals, and now we're still seeing only 30, 30 adults. So it is really, really, really small population, and it's a conservation problem that we're really trying to tackle. These guys are really cool in a number of ways. Firstly, they can survive up in these cold environments. They're also the only frog that creates its own toxin. So normally when a frog is poisonous, imagine a poison dart frog displaying their really bright colors. Now corroboree frog does that as well. They display these really bright colors to tell you, hey, please don't eat me. It's not going to be good for you or for me. So I'm just going to tell you about it first. But normally a frog will eat plants or other things in its environment where it can condense and use toxins that already exist. But the corroboree frog creates its own toxin, it creates its own alkaloid that is produced within the body, not from any food source that we've seen. So really, really unique. They also play a really important role in the alpine ecosystem. They help clean the waterways. So when they're tadpoles, they will eat algae as well as some other plants, and they'll help to filter that water and keep it that beautiful, pristine water that we see up in the Alpine. So just a really important part of the ecosystem. And we know diversity is so important to maintain, and these guys are part of it. Now, like a lot of frogs around the world, and I'm sure some of you may be aware, they are very much threatened by the chytrid fungus. The chytrid fungus is their main threat. So the chytrid fungus is a fungus that is a waterborne fungus, so it spreads through waterways, and it also takes a long time to kill its host. So it means that it can be on a frog or an individual for a while and spread to others before it kills that individual. So it means that it's able to spread when we see it on every single continent except Antarctica. So this is a huge threat to amphibian species all over the world, and it has reached our Australian Alpine region as well. So it is the main threat for our corroboree frog. But we are also seeing threats as well from climate change, habitat loss, fires and droughts, which have been exacerbated by climate change, as well as a lot of introduced species. So introduced species of plants may shade areas that need a little bit more light, so they're not thawing the same way, or they may absorb water. We have a lot of introduced animals that will be destroying the sensitive ecosystem in the Alpine region. So there are a lot of other threats, but the chytrid fungus is the main focus for conservation efforts at the moment. We are still learning a lot about this. We have a number of breeding programs that are in place around Australia for the corroboree frog, and we're focusing on maintaining a population that is stable within our captive breeding populations and then releasing them into areas that do not have the disease. And so there are enclosures up in the Snowy Mountain region that are controlled and disease free, but otherwise maintain the same habitat. And so we're hoping that they can breed more successfully in a more controlled but more wild environment. And we're also doing a lot of studies to investigate whether there could be a natural resistance or how we can help aid that process as it comes along. Because this is mainly the southern corroboree frog, but the northern corroboree frog, while also having the chytrid fungus, isn't seeing the same declines. And so we're asking why. Why is the northern corroboree frog not declining as rapidly? Have they developed a natural resistance? And some of the other frogs in the same area, so we have our eastern froglet, is also showing resistance. So we know it has chytrid fungus, but it's still surviving. And so if we can figure out what's going on there, maybe we can help the southern corroboree frog get up from just 30 individuals. So a really interesting project. This is a project like I've been aware of since I was a small child. This was quite a common, well advocated for program within at least the biology community in Australia. I remember going to the Taronga Zoo when I was really little and seeing the corroboree frog breeding tanks and learning about this problem. So it is well talked about, but we still need a lot of work to go into research and restoration. So definitely ongoing here. The other creature I wanted to mention is this gorgeous one. This is the mountain pygmy possum. So it is possum, it is a marsupial, it is related to the opossum in North America in that it's marsupial, but it's not related quite closely. So opossums is the only marsupial in North America, and then we have a whole host of species of possum in Australia that are quite different, but they are all marsupials, so they all have a pouch. This mountain pygmy possum is our only Australian mammal that is confined to the Alpine region. So we don't find it anywhere else. It's only found up here. We estimate there's about 2,000 individuals left in the Alpine region here. This is fully grown, you can see in Haley's hands here, and they usually weigh less than 100 grams. So very, very small. They are an important part of our ecosystem. Their main food source is the bogong moth, which is a moth kind of average size, a bit smaller than like a monarch butterfly, that spends a lot of its time as its larval stage, which is the main food source. So pygmy possums will eat the larvae caterpillars and get a lot of their fat reserves from that, as well as their protein. And then the adult bogong moths will actually migrate, kind of like the monarchs. They'll have their big breeding events further south, and then they'll come back up to the alpine areas to lay their eggs and continue their stay. But due to a lot of increased warming, we're seeing longer drought periods in the alpine regions. We're seeing far less snowfall. And so the bogong moths are not reproducing in the way that they used to. And so as a consequence, our mountain pygmy possum has suffered as well. The mountain pygmy possum is a really interesting and unique species for us because they consistently go into a hibernation or a torpor. So they completely shut down their metabolism and they wait through the coldest periods. The females will hold the highest altitude because that's more desirable, and the guys have to wait down a little bit lower, and then when it's breeding season, they come on up and reproduce. And they are reproducing okay when the conditions are good. So we see when we have good rainfall, we can get up to about 3,000 individuals, but when we're in those drought years, we consistently go down to 2,000. But what we're seeing now is longer droughts, and we're seeing more bushfires, which is destroying habitat, as well as the invasive species. And again, those bogong moths is really knocking on from that climate change that is happening in the alpine region. So it very much is an ecosystem approach that we need to look at when we're conserving these species. There are a lot of programs to, again, conserve these guys, maintain captive breeding. But the other thing as well is whether or not they could get used to living at lower altitudes, but in cool climate areas like our rainforests. So we have found in the fossil record that the mountain pygmy possum has actually been in lowland areas, and it has survived in lowland areas. And it's whether or not that during the last ice age, they got cut off from their lowland and then that population collapsed, but they could still survive. So that's a discussion being had as well, whether or not there could be some relocation efforts to other areas. Because the main concern with an increasing climate in these environments is normally if things are getting hotter, you go somewhere colder. But when we're looking at an alpine area, the only way to go somewhere colder is to go up. And if you're in less than 0.5% of Australia's landmass and you can't go up anymore, there's no way you can migrate. So there's got to be other ways that you can adapt to a warming climate. So this is where we're looking at a lot of different alpine species, not just in Australia, but around the world, where migration isn't necessarily an option just to go to somewhere cold. So it is a really important area of research. I think it's a really interesting area. We're doing a lot of amazing developments in our Snowy Mountain region, and there's a lot of projects. If you want to have a look up online, you can see what the latest research is, who you can support, and just kind of watch the space as well. And talking about it and sharing information is a really good way to do that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit generally, kind of touched on it already, about some of the natural and unnatural disturbances to alpine regions. All of our ecosystems are fluid. Things don't just exist in the same state all the time. We see ebbs and flows. We see the seasons change. In Australia, we see longer cycles like our droughts and then our floods. We have this sort of boom bust cycle that we see. In various regions, it can vary between annually, sometimes it's every 7 years. So we may have flooding for a period, like our El Nino and our La Nina cycles. We have a few of those cycles that impact Australia as well. So we do see these natural variations, and they are important to have some variation. This is where we see water move from areas that may not have had it. We see nutrients flow from certain areas. But more and more we're seeing what have been natural cycles turn into more unnatural cycles due to the exacerbation of all of these impacts. So our fire seasons, and I'm sure everyone's heard of the big Australian fires that we had in 2019, 2020. They were the largest areas that we've had historically. They were the hottest and the most ferocious. So we're looking at what would normally be here. We normally have fire, but now totally exacerbated. And this exacerbation is moving too quickly for a lot of our species to keep up and to change to that. So we really need to take in mind what these unnatural disturbances are, especially in these really sensitive alpine regions where there really isn't a limit. There's nowhere else you can go. You can't just keep going up to somewhere that doesn't exist. So these small areas become smaller and smaller, and we saw a lot of this habitat get destroyed in our latest fires. It is coming back, but it is vulnerable. So conserving this area means that we need to be mindful of how we travel through it. Staying on existing paths is such a simple way, but such an impactful way to make sure that you minimize your impact in this area. We do a lot of boardwalks that have already been established for a long time, and we just stick to those. Making sure that we're not bringing anything in. So Australia's biosecurity is strict for a reason because we have these very sensitive areas. But also when we move from national park to national park, we often clean our shoes to make sure that we're not bringing any fungus in or any other little parasites. We are not encouraging invasive species to continue to spread as well. So there's a lot of management that's going on in our alpine regions to minimize the impact of invasive species that we've seen across Australia. And then also everything that we do to try and minimize climate change. So all the impacts that you have down in the cities in the lowland, you can see Hobart in the background of this picture here, from this beautiful alpine region at the top of Bunyani, Mount Wellington. It has an impact. It all has an impact. The way that we've had our impact spread outwards, we can have our positive impacts upwards as well. So just a thing to think about as we move through. So like I mentioned, yeah, warming can't move higher, invasive species, and fire and droughts. This is our beautiful button grass moorlands that we see up in Cradle Mountain, and it really hosts so much diversity that is impacted by so many different factors as we move through. So I hope you get a little bit of a sense of what the alpine areas are like in Australia. Some of the unique things, our beautiful corroboree frog and our mountain pygmy possum. If you want to have a look at those two species, I would highly recommend it. It's a really important area, and we need all the help we can get. But also having a look at some of the regions home as well. I think when we travel and we have this huge love for all the places that we see and all the wildlife that we see, we have that at home as well. And so making sure that we have that local community effort and then taking that with you when you travel to new places. So walking through beautiful ancient forests mindfully, and just soaking in the beautiful alpine regions. So here, this is overlooking those beautiful button grass moorlands again. This is where we have breakfast in our southern itinerary, and just a little reminder to have a look about some of the unique places that we have around us. So that's my brief overview of the alpine regions of Australia. I'm going to dive into some of the other biomes in future webinars. I want to look at some of our desert spaces and some other species that you may not be aware about. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them through, and thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nikki. Before we start the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions field in your go-to webinar control panel. And if you're interested in traveling to Australia with NatHab and possibly joining Nikki on an expedition there, you can visit our website at nathab.com for trip details or call us at 800-543-8917 and ask to speak with an adventure specialist. All right, so diving into the questions here, Nikki, how did the disease that is killing the frogs arrive in Australia?
Mm, yeah, I don't know the exact mode of transport. I think there may have been a couple of times that it was brought across. We see a lot of diseases come across through trade and things being moved around, whether it's kept in any sort of product that has any water in it, or through any animals that migrate across. I'm not sure of the exact vector, if there was like a single catalyst that we've identified. But the chytrid fungus has permeated through all of the continents except Antarctica. So it is quite a sturdy and prolific fungus. You don't need much you just get a little bit, then it starts to multiply. And so it is a really serious issue that has really impacted frogs across the entire planet. So sometimes it feels a bit inevitable when it's a problem of that scale that it will make it to a country as big as Australia, unfortunately.
That makes sense. Thank you. And kind of a related question, somebody's wondering what some of the strategies are for keeping areas disease-free of the fungus if the fungus spreads through water.
Yeah, so that is quite a tricky problem, especially in alpine areas where you have this sort of peatland and it's like a wetland system, really. You need this water flowing through. So the enclosures that we have in the snowy mountains, they do have like a hard edge on them, and then they have their own contained water source. But whether they can filter some of that water and test that water consistently to then still integrate and get nutrients from the surrounding area, that is then monitored consistently. They can know how many individuals are in that area. If there's any indication that the chytrid fungus is moving in, then we can move those frogs out, clean the area, and kind of reestablish it. So they imagine like a large enclosure, but situated within the natural environment. So there are quite a lot of controls. It is very labor intensive and cost intensive. But at the moment, that's kind of what we need to keep some more stable populations.
Okay, thank you. We have another question asking about whether or not there's ever snowfall in Western Australia near Perth.
There are a couple of areas that get little dustings. There is a bit of elevation towards kind of the western third of Western Australia. So there are areas we will just get cold snaps that come through. Um, a lot of our weather in that area, we get a lot coming across from the west, but our cold snaps often come down from Antarctic winds. We have the roaring 40s that circle up the Australian bight. And so the very southern edge of Western Australia does get some cold weather, but it's not something that we see as consistently. It's definitely not something I would pack my skis for to go over in Perth. Um, but every now and then, as you would get a freak storm, you can get snow.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question, is Tasmania a distinct ecosystem from Australia, or have they evolved together in terms of flora and fauna?
Mhm. So Tasmania was connected to the mainland of Australia as recently, evolutionarily, we say recently, as about 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years ago was the last large glaciation event in Australia. That's where Kangaroo Island, where we go, and Tasmania were both connected to the mainland. So we do have a crossover of species that existed. That bridge would have still been a low-lying environment, so we still see species that would have developed in Tasmania, just separate based on the physical distance, and some of those mountain ranges as well will contribute to that. But we also see in Tasmania a lot of strongholds for things that did exist elsewhere, but now only exist in Tasmania. So while they were connected, because of their isolation, it's acted as a safeguard against other things that have changed. So we see our Nophofagus, which is our myrtle beech trees. They are found in the fossil record in Antarctica and Argentina, when we're all connected as this southern continent, but now they're really only surviving very well in Tasmania. So it is an ecosystem. There are species that would have existed elsewhere, but now are very uniquely only found in Tasmania. And within Tasmania, we have a few different ecosystems. So we have, all the way up to our Alpine, to our grasslands and our beach and marine environments. There's a lot of variation there, but it really is really cool and ancient stronghold for a lot of species.
Interesting. Thank you. So, does the rocky terrain in some of these portions of Australia or Tasmania hinder access to some areas of interest?
Uh, for where we're not really. There are a few rocky peaks. There are some nice kind of rocky walks that you can do. When we go to Cradle Mountain, we are there for a couple of days. We'll be adding an extra day in 2025, which I'm super excited about because there is so much to see there. I can flick back to if I go to Cradle Mountain here, you can see that it is still sort of more flat areas around the base, and then we have these little pillars that come up of this more rocky terrain. So when we do walks here, there's an hour walk that is optional that we can do. It is with rocky and uneven terrain, but the paths are pretty good. Um, and then we go into boardwalks as we start to come into that alpine grassland. So it it really isn't a big factor. It's not something that we go to for a lot of mountaineering or anything like that. I'm a rock climber myself, so I think there's really not that much rock there. In terms of the areas of interest that we go to, the infrastructure is really, really good.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so that's actually the last question that we've received today. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Nikki, for any closing comments.
I just want to thank you all for tuning in once again, and I hope that you enjoyed the beautiful alpine regions of Australia. It's a little bit different than what you might expect from alpine regions around the world, and I think it's really interesting to show how many differences there are in this big old land down under that varies quite a lot from the rest of the world. And I hope that you can take some of that curiosity everywhere that you go and everywhere that you travel. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today, Nikki. I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us next week for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great weekend.